Welcome to the show. Oh, now we're live. All right, so welcome to the show. It's the Future Freedom. I'm your host, Scott Horton, and my permanent guest is Jacob Hornberger. Hi, Jacob.
Hey, Scott.
How are you doing tonight?
Doing great. Great to be here with you.
Good to have you here. Okay, so the deal is this is our new show for Liberty.me. We'll be here every Thursday night, and Jacob is the founder and president of the Future Freedom Foundation. I'm sure you guys, almost all of you, are very familiar. They've been around. I mean, he's been a libertarian since way back. They've been an institution since 1989, and he's got an entire stable of great writers there. They have a monthly journal that they put out that's also called the Future Freedom, and that's James Bovard, Anthony Gregory, Wendy McElroy, of course Jacob himself, was including Sheldon Richman, a whole lot of stuff by him, and Richard Ebling and Scott McPherson, and on and on and on, a ton of really great libertarian writers there, of course, at FFF. And that website, fff.org, is just an absolute trove. I mean, they've got the archives, again, going back decades. So highly encourage people to check that site out for the libertarian take on every single thing ever. It's all there, including all the wars and everything else. And Jacob, of course, himself is a great libertarian and a great enemy of the national security state, which is very important to yours truly. And this is something that we've talked about before, Jacob, but I think is probably a good way to introduce you to the audience. For those not familiar, there's an essay that Murray Rothbard wrote back in, I think, in the 1990s. I guess it could have been earlier, called "Do You Hate the State?" Oh, I think it may have been the 70s or something. I don't know. Anyway, he was saying, I prefer a radical minarchist to a conservative anarchist any day. And he was attacking the utilitarian case for anarchy. That anarchy would work really, really well if we would just let there be a free market, but no reason why we ought to want anything to work well. That kind of thing. And Murray said, a real libertarian hates injustice. That's why we're here. Okay, because we can't stand it, because it ain't right, and we're here to fix it and make it right. That's it. And so if that's not what you're doing here, then forget it. And but then some of us draw a line. We draw lines in different places. And I know you're a minarchist and a constitutionalist, and yet obviously a radical, and obviously focused always with your priorities on the very worst things about what our government is doing to us in descending order there. So I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit. I think that's a good way to introduce you and sums you up very well as far as from what I know of you over all these years. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit of why you're not just a hardcore anarcho-capitalist radical like the rest of us. You're a radical, but you stop at constitutionalism. Why is that?
Yeah, well, it's a matter of asking myself, what is the role of government in a free society? That's the fundamental question. That's the question that, in my opinion, every American should be asking. Because obviously there are so many different potential answers. Liberals say the role of government is to play a role in charity, make people good, make people caring, on pain of putting them in the penitentiary if they don't pay their taxes that go to the welfare state. Conservatives feel the same way. The role of government, they say, is to invade other countries and effect regime change operations and so forth, put people in a jail for ingesting substances that they say are harmful. Well, as I was discovering libertarianism, I realized that none of these are legitimate functions of government. And so how do I determine that? What is a legitimate function of government? Well, that raises the libertarian non-aggression principle. That is, that it's wrong to initiate force against another person. It's wrong to murder, it's wrong to rape, steal, burglarize, commit fraud. Anything that infringes on the rights of someone else, that's no good. But other than that, as long as your conduct is peaceful, you should be free to do whatever you want. So a free society is one in which people are free to engage in any peaceful activity, even if it's irresponsible, immoral, destructive, self-destructive, dangerous, as long as their conduct is peaceful. So people are free to ingest drugs, climb mountains, skydive, do whatever they want as long as their conduct is peaceful. Now the question is that does this presuppose a certain governmental framework? And that's really the difference between the anarchists and the minarchists. That the minarchist says the free society presupposes a certain monopoly framework on the employment of force. That you need to have this governmental structure punishing the murderers and the rapists and the thieves and the burglars, while the anarchist says, well, no, the free market is so good that you can have the free market generate the framework itself. The minarchist would say, no, that's not possible. If you don't have the framework, you're not going to have a free society. Now, if we take, for example, the case of an accused murderer, I would say 98%, I think anarchists would agree with this, 98% of anarchists, of people in society, are basically good people. They're not murderers, they're not rapists, they're not thieves, they're not burglars. You go to a mall and most people are behaving themselves. They're not stealing, they're not assaulting other people. So it's a basically, fair and just society. Now there's a few shoplifters, there's a few muggers. Let's say that that's like 2%. I don't know what the exact number is, but let's just say it's 2% of society. I want, and I think most people want, those 2% to be slammed away in a jail. Like if they murder somebody, I want that murderer in jail. Now I want to give him due process. I want to let him have a jury trial, let him go through all the proper procedures, right to counsel. But once he's ultimately convicted, I want him in jail. And that's the big benefit of the minarchist paradigm, is that when somebody commits a crime, the 98% have put together a governmental structure that says, we're coming after you. In the anarchist society, they fight for the right of the 2% to have their own judicial system. Because by necessity, anarchism says everybody can compete in the provision of judicial services. You can't stop somebody from competing in the provision of judicial services under anarchy. So that means that every accused murderer, the 2% have just as much right to establish their own judicial system as the 98%. Well, once you arrive at that, how do you determine whose judgment is going to prevail? For example, in this case right now where this lady, this clerk in Kentucky, is refusing to comply with the federal court order on granting licenses to same-sex couples, she has a final judgment against her from the monopoly state and specifically the federal jurisdiction. Federal jurisdiction is predominant in this case. It has ordered all state officials to issue those licenses. She says, I'm not going to comply with your order. And she's refused to comply with the monopoly state's order. So what does the monopoly state do? Well, here you see the force of government. I mean, this is the real force of government. This is where the rubber meets the road. U.S. Marshals go, I don't know if this actually happened, but I assume it did. U.S. Marshals go and arrest her using force. If she resists that, she's going to be pretty much in the hereafter because she doesn't have as much force as those U.S. Marshals do. Suppose she had her own defense force and her own judicial system that said, no, we rule in her favor. Well, now you got two conflicting jurisdictions. Which one's going to prevail? Which judgment should prevail? Well, I can tell you that the judgment that's going to prevail is with the defense force that's the stronger force. If the federal government comes with marshals and they encounter a band of state police, all the federal government's going to do is call the 82nd Airborne Division in. So the bigger force is always going to prevail over the smaller force. So even under anarchy, I submit that you're going to end up with the same situation, with the stronger force always conquering and dominating the smaller force. So the advantage of the minarchist position is that it does not violate the libertarian non-aggression principle. Voluntarily funded, because that's one of the objections that anarchists bring to minarchists sometimes, that they believe in taxation. I don't believe in taxation. I believe that this monopoly state should be voluntarily funded. And so that doesn't violate the libertarian non-aggression principle. So from my perspective, no anarchist has ever been able to say, Jacob, your paradigm of limited government violates the libertarian non-aggression principle. But I say that I have the additional advantage that I can impose a final judgment on the 2% while the anarchist cannot. That answers your question, I think.
All right. Well, there's a few things there. That's interesting to talk about. First of all, isn't the monopoly state imposing its jurisdiction? Isn't that aggression? They come and claim the right to lay their hands on you, even if they didn't force you to finance them in the first place.
Well, absolutely not, because you see, I hold that you have a right of self-defense. that if somebody attacks me, I have a right to kill him. If he's using deadly force against me, I have a right to use deadly force in defense of my life or defense of a third person. So if I kill him, I don't consider that initiation of force. I consider it a defensive force. So if somebody kills somebody else, one might say, I guess, that if you go after him to arrest him, to put him in jail, that you're initiating force. But I say no, that still is part of the defensive force that goes to say if you go and hurt somebody, even though that person can't defend himself at the time when you shoot him and kill him or assault him, he has the right to come and apprehend you and bring you to trial and punish you for what you did.
Yeah, but if somebody accuses you of murder and they come and get you and resist, they'll kill you. You have no right to resist their process for deciding whether you really did what they say you did or not.
That's right, but once you say that they don't have a right to do that, then you can't arrest anybody because everybody's presumed innocent. So you're going to have murderers walking the street because as soon as you go and try to arrest them, they'll say, no, wait a minute. You haven't proven me guilty. You don't have a right to take me into custody and try me. I say that anybody that's accused of a crime, and I think even under the anarchist paradigm, that anybody that's accused of murder by one jurisdiction, that jurisdiction has the right to bring him in and punish him for it. I don't think the anarchists say let murderers walk free because they're presumed innocent and we haven't proven them guilty. I mean that's essentially, it seems to me, what you're saying. So how would you ever capture or take any murderer into custody?
All right, but here we live in a situation where the Constitution is no guarantee of minarchy whatsoever, even though it describes a bare sort of general government. And in fact, every government employee, state, local, and federal, have almost complete immunity from the law. They're all above the law. And then on top of them, you talk about the 2% of lowly street criminals, who, of course, as we would agree, it's the government drug war and those kind of inflation and other government policies that make people so poor and turn to crime in the first place for the most part anyway. But what about the 1% of the people who, like the commies say, the 1% versus the 99, and they have total sway over the government, over the regulation of the rest of us. And it seems to me like they're the criminals getting away with it scot-free rather than a mugger or something like that.
I question that entirely. I think that if you did a survey of people who believe in, say, the welfare state, it would come out predominantly the American people, like, say, probably at least 80% would say, yeah, we believe in the welfare state. And if you asked them, well, do you believe in the existence of the Pentagon and the CIA? I bet you the number would still be just as high. Now, libertarians or libertarian minarchists have never claimed that a constitution's going to protect a free society. I mean, let's face it, a constitution is a piece of paper. And so a piece of paper can never really protect a society that comes into existence that's free. And we've never claimed that. At most, what a constitution can do is protect you against majority tyranny up to a certain point. Let's say that you've got 60% of people that want to put drug dealers into jail without trial. The Constitution has done a very good job at prohibiting that. It requires, like, you look at the Bill of Rights, due process of law, jury trials, and so forth. And so it's done a I would say, a perfect job in ensuring jury trials for drug deal defendants, drug users, drug gangs. And while I think there's a lot of people who would favor having the same kind of judicial system like at Guantanamo Bay for terrorism for drug dealers. So the Constitution does a very good job and did do a very good job in certain respects. If you look, for example, from 1787 to let's say 1900, it's a phenomenal period. I mean, I'm not saying that it was a libertarian paradise. Let me give my standard disclaimer here, because before people start writing me emails, we know it wasn't. There was slavery, there was corporatism, there was land grants to the railroads. But for 100 years, government was very effective. That's 100 years. That's not a short period of time. You had no Social Security, no Medicare, no Medicaid, no central bank, Federal Reserve, no paper money, no gun control, no drug laws, no public schooling to think of. or to refer to. There was a little bit of public schooling in Massachusetts and compulsory attendance laws. There was very few economic regulations, no immigration controls. Now, that was an example of limited government operating for over 100 years. Well, what happens? How come all of a sudden we have this huge welfare warfare state? And so anarchists sometimes say to me, Jacob, it just shows you that monarchy doesn't work. Well, it worked for over 100 years. You say it didn't work. Not perfectly. Nobody's saying it was perfect. But by and large, when you compare life in, say, 1890 in terms of freedom and limited government to today, it's phenomenal. Okay, so what happened? Well, perspectives change among people, and they did change among the American people. The progressives started coming in with their ideas of minimum wage laws and Social Security and public schooling, and gradually those started to gain weight over the arguments of the libertarians that said, no, we don't want this socialism, we don't want this interventionism, and the same thing with the warfare state. So all of a sudden, by the time the 1930s come along, it's like a tsunami where people are ready for the welfare state. They're welcoming the welfare state. No constitution is going to protect against that. I mean, for a while, the Supreme Court justices were fighting against it. It was a fierce battle. They were declaring much of what Roosevelt was doing unconstitutional. They were saying this is alien to the founding principles of this country and the Constitution. But all of a sudden, it's like a tsunami. Roosevelt people start retiring from the court. He starts appointing his cronies in there, and the tsunami just overwhelms the entire system. So when public opinion changes, there's nothing you're going to be able to do to stop that. Like I say, it'll stop it for a while, a constitution, but not a tsunami. And the same thing with respect to the warfare after World War II. Now let me say something about anarchy here. The same principle applies to anarchy. I mean, when you've got an anarchy situation, and let's just say there's no monopoly state, it's all these private competing agencies, and everybody's got a right to compete, including the mafia and the criminals and so forth. If all of a sudden 98% of people in the anarchist society decide that they want a monopoly totalitarian state, I will guarantee you there is nothing in anarchy that's going to stop them from doing that. You can't pass a law in anarchy that says you're prohibited from establishing a totalitarian state. So ultimately, Scott, it really does depend on convincing people of what the rightful role of government is. If you convince people that government should not be in the charity business, should not be in the education business, and I'm not saying you got to convince everybody. I've always held that all you got to do is convince a critical mass of people, and that can be less than a majority. Then all of a sudden society shifts, and all of a sudden now you're dismantling the welfare state. That doesn't mean you got to dismantle the police. Now, I agree with you. The police are very abusive today. But my argument is that once you get down to a minimal state, the police start behaving accordingly, that you don't have the big militarization that comes from the national security state, the warfare state. Police now become friends of the public. They become your neighborhood police officer, walking the beat, protecting you against the murderers, the rapists, and the thieves. Same thing with the warfare state. If we can convince people that the warfare state's wrong, this is not a legitimate function of the U.S. government. We go to John Quincy Adams' famous speech on In Search of Monsters to Destroy. And all of a sudden people say, you know what? Intervention as an empire are wrong. They're wrong for America. Let's dismantle the Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA, and then the DEA at the same time, because government shouldn't be punishing people for ingesting substances. All of a sudden, you're left with a very small government, voluntarily funded, where people, if they don't like what it's doing, they can withhold their funds. And that to me is what a free society would look like. Now, I guess an anarchist would say, well, I still don't like the fact that they're punishing murderers. Well, okay, but if you're not murdering somebody, you shouldn't worry about it. Is it possible that you could be wrongfully accused? Of course. But that risk of being wrongfully accused exists in anarchy as well, by one of those private defense forces and judicial systems.
All right. And now, of course, a lot of this comes down to arguing about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, whether we're going to have a limited constitutional republic or anarchy, anarchist society, when right now we live in the most corrupt, most brutal world empire on the planet, and by far. And I mean, I don't know if anybody's really tallied up the millions killed by the U.S. government since World War II, but it's millions and millions and millions at this point. So all that is, it is interesting, but it's not necessarily the bottom line. And I think,
let me say something about that, just in case you plan on going to another point.
Sure. Yeah, I was about to. Go ahead.
Well, that's a really important point you make, and I'm glad you raised that, because I have a friend, a libertarian friend, and we used to debate this all the time. I mean, I've been debating anarchy versus minarchy since I became a libertarian. When I first went to FEE as program director in 1987, the first thing I did in the summer seminar, much of the consternation of the old FEE guard there, were very unhappy with what I did. At the summer seminars, I organized anarchy versus limited government debates. So I've been debating this a long time, but as my friend and I once said, let's get down to the limited government state, to the night watchman state, and then we'll battle over whether to privatize him or not. Because there is such a monumental problem out there in terms of the gigantic welfare state and the warfare state that it really behooves us as libertarians, whether minarchists or anarchists, to keep our eyes focused on that. I mean, there's nothing more that the totalitarian, tyrannical state would love to do than to see libertarians fighting all the time. Now, I think these debates are fun, they're enjoyable, and especially late-night sessions at seminars and stuff, but we should never lose sight of the fact that our ultimate aim is the free society. We can do a lot for freedom by dismantling the drug war, the warfare state, Social Security, the welfare state, the Pentagon, the NSA, and so forth, leaving an apparatus that anarchists still won't be happy with, but then we'll debate that at the time.
Yeah, well, and certainly, we can start with all the very worst stuff first. The world empire, the torture, the prison without trial, the stuff that, according to the mythology, we left back in the age of the barbarians, but apparently have brought with us into the 21st century here. And so this is actually what I was going to get to, which is you put immigration at the very top of that list of priorities, right up there with the warfare state and the rest of it, and I really have not done so. I know it's important, it just hasn't been important enough to me really to become a major interest of mine. But my friend and yours, Anthony Gregory, was pointing out to me about just the unlimited brutality of the American immigration system, all the people that are held in federal pens, all across the Southwest, Texas and west from here. And how Obama has deported more people than George W. Bush ever did, maybe twice as many or something like that. And it's just this huge issue. And yet at the same time, of course, we got Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders are protectionist on this issue. They want to protect American business from foreign competition, and they want to protect American workers from immigration competition. And people are dying to hear this right now. Just as you said about the 1930s, we're in an economic crisis, and people are just absolutely eating this up more than anything else about Donald Trump and Sanders both. And so there's a real concern here of regular people, Jacob, and if you say it's misplaced, you got to make a very convincing argument, apparently, because they're pretty convinced that building a Great Wall of Texas is what's going to solve this problem here.
Oh yeah. I mean, sometimes I listen to Trump, and I'm tempted to call him Benito Trump because I feel like I'm in Mussolini's Italy with all his corporatism and regulations and restrictions and government business partnerships and closing the borders and so forth, regulating the movements of people. Scott, this immigration issue, it is so horrible in what it's doing to people. And not just the immigrant. I mean, we can see the immigrants dying in Europe right now because of immigration controls, and more directly because of the wars that the U.S. government, the national security state, has waged over there. And that's the real irony of this thing, is that the government's gone over there and created all this crisis with devastation of war in Syria and Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen. And so people are trying to save their lives from the chaos and the crises and the ravages that the U.S. government has done. And as
same for the Mexican drug war, yeah.
Yeah, same thing over here. That they create all this chaos with their drug war, as you point out, and so people are fleeing it or sending their children north to save their lives, and then all of a sudden you wage war against those people themselves. So that's why to us libertarians, it all fits. It's like a mosaic. All these issues fit together. Sometimes people think we're just bringing a hodgepodge number of issues together, the drug war, foreign interventionism, the immigration. They all fit together. And I discovered libertarianism partly because of those detention centers down there on the border where I was living in Laredo, Texas. I mean, that's when it came to me one day. I was a liberal. Now, I was a liberal Democrat. I believed in the welfare state. I was the ACLU rep in Laredo. I was on the Legal Aid Board of Trustees, which provided free legal assistance to the poor. I believed in the welfare state. And then I'm walking around this detention center one day because I'm representing clients there, and it just hits me. If liberals love the poor so much, why are they putting these people in these detention centers that really look like concentration camps? Because all they want to do is work. That's all they want to do. That's their crime, wanting to work. And I went and started talking to my friends. I said, how do you reconcile this with your love of the poor with the welfare state? And all they kept telling me was the law is the law. Well, segregation was the law. You know, laws in Germany against Jews were the law. That doesn't answer anything. And finally, I discovered libertarianism, and I realized, wow, what a great philosophy. Because now you're talking about freedom and free markets, the right of people to move, the freedom of travel, the freedom of association, economic liberty, liberty of contract. Why not a system where people are free to cross borders in search of work, to better their lives, to associate with others, with tour? They don't have to become citizens. There's a million Americans living in Mexico right now. They're not citizens. They still cheer for the Dallas Cowboys, and they retain their American citizenship. They don't assimilate. Who cares? And that's when it hit me. This crisis, this immigration crisis, it will never be solved. I've seen it since I was a kid in the 1950s, Scott. I've seen people railing against the immigrants and do something. The same thing you see going on with Trump today, it was going on in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, all the way through. And that's because this model of socialist central planning applies to immigration. You've got government trying to plan in a top-down fashion the movements of millions of people. And so that's why you have this chaos. It's an inherently defective system. The only solution, I keep telling people this, that if you keep beating your head against the wall, you're going to end up with a headache. And the only way to get rid of that headache is to stop beating your head against the wall. The only solution, I repeat, there is no other solution to the immigration crisis. There's the Berlin Wall and all that. Because remember, they told us the Berlin Fence was going to solve the problem. The only solution is freedom and free markets. In other words, our heritage, as I was saying earlier in the 19th century, open immigration, the free movements of people across borders.
Okay, now here's the thing. Obviously, I'm for that, and I'm against all nationalism. I'm for the right of anybody to travel wherever they want. Wherever a government claims ownership of the commons, I think they don't have the right to discriminate as people want to travel through there. All those kind of things. However, you haven't really addressed the why Americans, regular people, not Donald Trump, the fascist, but all of his adoring fans, are regular people from the neighborhood who have been dying to hear somebody say what he says about too many Hispanics coming north, and we got to stop them because, what, Jacob? It's changing their lives in ways that they can't stand, or they think it is, so why are they wrong?
Well, throughout American history, there's been an anti-immigrant prejudice among certain groups of people. I kind of think it's in the DNA. I mean, like libertarians. I kind of think libertarians are kind of like born libertarians, and you can't really make libertarians. And people figure out that they're libertarians, but I think it's the same thing with this anti-immigrant prejudice that throughout the 19th century, people hated the Irish, they hated the Italians, they called them wops, they hated the Germans. They hated the Chinese, the Japanese over on the West Coast, the Hispanics after the U.S. government took over the northern half of Mexico in the Treaty of Guadalupe. Guadalupe Hidalgo. I mean, there's always been this prejudice among a certain group of people against newcomers. There's this xenophobia type thing. We just have to keep arguing our position that, look, immigration is consistent with American values and principles. It's consistent with biblical principles, loving thy neighbor as thyself, and it's consistent with economic prosperity. This is a key to economic prosperity. This is one of the reasons why the United States was the most prosperous country in the world in the 19th century. By the way, Argentina copied our policy of open immigration and low taxes and low regulations around the latter part of the 19th century. They immediately became this prosperous nation, lost it when Perón came in with his Franklin Roosevelt philosophy. But we just got to keep standing our ground, Scott. And you know what? I think people will ultimately come to us, because where else do they have to go? What, more crises, more police state? You go down to the border. If you want a police state, go down to the border, because that's where you're going to see it, with those immigration checkpoints and border patrol and roving patrol cars stopping people on the highways. It's pretty bad.
Yeah. Well, and of course, I mean, the thing is, too, is we live in not necessarily the worst of economic times. Obviously, you could argue, you know, poor people don't live too bad in this country and those kinds of things. But it's always, the economy is always being disrupted. It's always a boom or a bust or some unpredictable thing. There is regime uncertainty in the minds of virtually all economic actors in America on the lowest and middle levels of the income scale, too. So, you know, people are confused, and it's a lot easier to see a Mexican in your neighborhood than it is to see Wall Street bankers and Federal Reserve, you know, technicians up there who are really responsible for the policies that cause such distortions and dislocations. And if you're a poor white person, then hey, you can always still kick down onto poor black people or Mexican immigrants or whoever like that who have even less political power than you, and get to feel like, you know, at least you're avenging yourself somehow, when the alternative is you got to learn about central banking, and you got to you know, go to the Mises Institute and study all these texts and figure out who your real enemy is. And yeah, it's just easier. And this is exactly the kind of thing that, you know, we've seen it over and over again. It's been predicted, obviously, in this country since 2008, that, you know, us libertarians have to really shout out loud that all we need is liberty right now, because the time is ripe for demagogues from the right or the left to come and demonize the politically powerless and get away with it. And here we are. The easiest, I mean, Donald Trump just walks right in there and just picks it right up.
That is a fantastic point. I mean, the point you're saying is that government, through its policies, the welfare state, the warfare state, the regulated economy, central planning, creates all these economic problems. I mean, that's really the root of America's economic problems: the out-of-control spending, the debt, and it's getting worse. And then minimum wage laws, so they cause dislocations in terms of unemployment. And so people are suffering. They can't save any money. Nobody saves any money anymore. Right. And so they need scapegoats. You know, they don't see that government is caused these problems, and they don't want to think about the government. The government's like their daddy. The government's like their savior, giving them Social Security and welfare and unemployment and so forth. So what do? They look for scapegoats. I mean, this is what was happening in Germany, when Hitler starts blaming the Jews for all of Germany's economic problems. I mean, and it's getting ugly over here too. You know, I just read about a case where a couple of guys beat up a homeless Hispanic guy, an immigrant, beat him up and then urinated on him. And they said that Donald Trump inspired him to do this. I mean, that's ugly. That brings to mind these totalitarian nations in history where they were going after scapegoats. The root of the economic problems, as you say, is not the immigrant. He's the scapegoat. He's a convenient scapegoat because he can't defend himself. That's why we libertarians have to come to their defense. These are the undefendable, or the people that cannot defend themselves. And it's incumbent on us libertarians to come to their defense, because nobody else is. And they're dying. That's the thing about here. They're not just dying in Europe. They're dying in the back of 18-wheelers in Texas. They're dying on the deserts in Arizona. And all of this is because of immigration central planning. And so we're the hope, Scott, libertarians are. We're the hope for better economic times here, through a free market philosophy instead of a welfare socialist state, better peaceful times instead of a national security state empire paradigm. And we're the hope for people that are drug addicts, that are trying their best to get off of drugs, but they get sent to the penitentiary instead. And we're the hope for the immigrants, the people that are being persecuted, vilified, and scapegoated when they're not responsible for any of this. All they're trying to do is just better their lives.
And that is Jacob Hornberger. That is the Future Freedom Foundation, fff.org. Check out the newsletter, the monthly journal, The Future Freedom, same as this show, at fff.org/subscribe. Check out Jacob's blog. He writes every single day, or I don't know, four times a week at least, something like that there, at fff.org/blog. And we will be back here next Thursday for another episode of The Future Freedom. Thanks very much, Jacob. It's been great, a great first episode here.
Hey, I greatly enjoyed it. Looking forward to more of them. Thank you, Scott.
And thank all you guys for tuning in tonight. Appreciate it.